Good evening to everyone. Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
That was smooth.
Good.
That was a smooth
Good,
entrance.
good day,
Night.
good day.
Good morning, good afternoon, good night, whatever day it is, whatever time
Yeah,
in your world.
in my world, it's morning and night simultaneously. That's how crazy it is.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. I appreciate you both for taking the effort to join the show. I'm going to introduce you and then I want you to introduce yourselves. Then we're going to go into the topic. And we are going to go where we probably wouldn't normally in this discussion, hopefully, because we've got some digging to do and understanding to do. But allow me to introduce you guys to Nathan and Stephen. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Nathan is someone I've met once. We had an interesting discussion on the panel. It's on YouTube. And he responded to the post I put out, which we'll look at in a moment. And Steve, I think it was through Instagram. Oh, no, LinkedIn.
Yeah, through linked. You put out a really good question. And I was like, yeah, I'm up for that.
Okay. So this is lovely. So we're, like I said, we're going to have this discussion. I want, by the end of this show, for people to know more and to know that they don't know as much as they thought they did, I guess. But to leave with the ability to assess and to process more effectively. So welcome to everyone again. Nathan, just introduce yourself, please.
Good day, all. My name is Nathan. Instagram handle is at Constructive Discourse 2021. My day job is a business studies teacher. Been teaching for about 8 years now. And yeah, I'm also an aspiring critical thinker, and I'm always willing to learn.
Yeah, lovely.
And good to meet you, Nathan.
Yeah, likewise.
Cheers.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, name's Steve. Sound funny because I'm from Canada, right? So relocated into the UK up in the Manchester area, but social worker by trade. I would share the Instagram profile, but I have one follower and it's Curtis. It got set up this week, so I can jump into this. So, do you know what? If you find me, feel free to follow. It's sporadic though. But yeah, social worker by trade. I think, just lifelong learner and very kind of curious about other people's knowledge, my own knowledge, and how to use that knowledge responsibly.
Yeah. Okay. So we have an open-minded, and we have Nathan. You haven't even opened a box, but you're interested in learning more and critically thinking. Okay, we have that, but I think there's more to you. You've been a bit of a Jason Bourne tonight, but we're gonna. And as for me, I'm a social worker. I'm nobody much. But guys, before we go into it, just tell us where you are if you're a student or if you are on placement, if you're doing your master's or degree or whatever you're doing, or if you're just listening. Let us know what you are so that we know who we're talking to. It'd be great. Let me introduce the topic. So I put out a post. I'll tell you why I put out the post in the light of what was in the media. So obviously, second year student, lovely. There was a situation where, how can I put this without going into too much detail? There was a fight between some young people, and racism was claimed. Yet they were both from minority backgrounds. So what I did was I put out a post because I found it interesting that two minorities, one of them being white, not by appearance, we couldn't tell who they were until they spoke, but two minorities, and there was racism between them apparently, okay, at the time. And then there was also a situation with Tyree Nichols, who was, I think he died, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
beaten up by, interestingly, 5 black officers and I think 1 white, possibly. But he was beaten up by what we say his own kind. And so I was like, we have to go deep on this. I spoke to Nathan lightly on this. Guys, I want you to know that as we have this discussion, I want you to draw from it, because for me, for Nathan, for Steve, this is a lot of learning. We came here to not only share, but learn. But I want to learn from how you identify people and how you identify their experiences. And I'm sure that tonight we are going to be able to pay attention to who we are supporting, or as in Nathan's case, teaching, however he does what his work is. We've got some 2nd-year students, youth practitioner, 2nd-year student. Let's go, where are we? Youth worker, behavioral support, yep. 2nd-year student, social work team manager, newly qualified social worker. Someone's echoing, I hope not. So that post, I said, you've muted me. Okay, so you can unmute when you want to talk. Yeah. I said racism is not linear, meaning it's not just I don't like black people or don't like white people. I don't like Irish. I don't like Scots. I don't like, you know, whoever, Africans, whoever. It's not as simple as that. I think racism is a very diverse topic, and I think people use the term without really understanding what they are saying. I don't think people who are racist even understand their own racism a lot of the time. What do they mean by it? What is their hatred about? But yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to just jump in with a point to just, you know, Steve, if you want to go ahead, I'll give you first. You know, what's your take on the topic at this stage?
Well, it's interesting because it's oddly in different ways. I don't have necessarily a full-on take, but I'm trying to unpick it, because when you put out that post and that you saw, like you said, it's not linear, non-linear. It was that phrasing that really intrigued me, to kind of go, hold on, let me think about this. Do you know what I mean? Let me just rattle this around in my brain. Just before we came in, I got curious. I haven't done this before, and I thought, I wonder what the dictionary says about non-linear. And I pulled up a definition, and I thought it was a fascinating definition. It says, involving a situation in which one thing does not change at the same rate as another, so that the relationship between them changes. And I was just thinking, do you know what? That comes out like of a scientific kind of mathematician's definition of nonlinear. How applicable to people from the same culture or background, that one changes, but not at the same pace as another, in a sense. And I was just kind of thinking that when you get into that, the other thing that's been rattling in my brain a bit is racism, and then the parallel between that and power. Because in a lot of ways, it's about either trying to have power over someone else by how you define or other people, right? Or how you kind of don't have it. And then even when you're talking about in the same kind of, I don't know, groupings, categories, whatever you want to do it, cultures, how you can have that layer upon layer of different power in there that is kind of almost a in-group type of kind of association. Do you know what I mean? If that makes sense, it's like power over another within your own group in order to satisfy whatever it is that needs to be satisfied.
Wow.
So that, yeah, did we go deep fast? Is that too fast?
No, I'm making a note. I'm going to hand it over to Nathan. I'm making a note of something you said.
Yeah, so for myself, I agree with Stephen. It's racism and power, they correlate. And my definition of racism has evolved over the years. So I was reading Dr. Claude Anderson's book, Powernomics, and it came out in the 90s, and he gave a really good definition. Now, I can't recollect because it was a small paragraph of how he defined racism, and he used the words economically, socially, environmentally. He used all of those words that understood, or that was part of racism. So I think racism has moved on from the fundamentals of my race is superior to another race. I think it's a lot more nuanced now. And in the modern day, we have to understand that racism is a malleable term, and we can't stick to the rigid understanding of it just being my race is superior to the other race, because it's not like that anymore. And actually, going back to what Stephen said, and I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but whenever the question gets put forward to certain sections of the black community, when they're asked, can black people be racist? When they say no, they can't be racist, unfortunately, they lack a lot of um, the reasoning and rationale behind that. And I would purport that the reason why many black people don't think that they're racist or cannot be racist is not necessarily due to prejudice, but more because of power. And we know that from a socio-economical perspective, the race of Africans, the diaspora, we are at the bottom. There are some examples in America where Nigerian women, black women, are doing very well. But in the West, and well, more specifically in Europe, we are at the bottom. So I think a lot of us, we tend not to attach the reason why we don't think black people can be racist. But again, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing. I just think that sometimes when this question gets put forward and then there's an answer, it lacks substance, and that's why there's such there's such divide, but also there's a lot of hostility between different races.
Yeah. Wow, that's deep. Like it's good. It's good though. It's like getting thinking. Do you know what I mean? Like it's really kind of getting the thoughts kind of popping around in my mind with that. Do you know what I mean?
I can't hear you.
Yeah, yeah. Curtis, your video, your
Look at me, I'm muting all that time, yapping
there
away.
you go. There you go. Cheers.
It's like it's Microsoft Teams, like everyone's on mute, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was going to say that there's a comment here, and it says that African women are the most highly educated demographic. And it looks like education
in America.
In America, I think, and one of possibly here as well, but it doesn't. It probably it probably goes to show that the under the skin of society, especially in the UK, because racism isn't so overt. They can still be on their back foot despite having their degrees. So it shows you that there's the power that is there that can really make your educational status of non-effect. What I want to do is I'm going to ask you all some questions, I guess, and if you would just define it, and then we're going to go into some of the things you've already said, okay? But here we are learning. What is racism in a nutshell for you, Steve?
It's interesting. I think it's kind of funny that I would have to kind of, if I was trying to press for a definition, which is happening, is to say that it's almost a blind judgment on somebody that is made, that's ill-informed because it doesn't consider who they are. It's like that first appearance of, or taking in of somebody, if that makes sense, whether it's by word, by visual, by sound. And it's just, you form, like, it's just kind of, it's almost like a stress response for some people.
Wow.
That it's kind of, because of this, because of that sound, sight, whatever I see that comes from that part of the world, this is how I'm responding. In a sense, that's kind of the best way I can kind of put it into. And it just shuts everything off. Like your whole prefrontal cortex goes down because you're just No.
You're not reasoning. This is what it is from the
Yeah.
back of your brain, that carnal brain. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that way, it's quite kind of firm in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like it's inflexible,
Yeah.
but there's also, I think, the more insidious kind of creep that comes into it. It's the stuff that we see every day that's in front of us and we keep doing in a lot of ways. Do you know what I mean? It's
Are you talking about more of the systemic level?
yeah, like kind of that systemic stuff that kind of, it's like that kind of, when it's interesting, it's kind of certain people get passed over.
Yeah.
And or not, kind of, the doors aren't opened.
Yeah.
So so you've got the kind of the conscious kind of stuff, and then you got the and like you say, the stuff that is passively conscious.
Right.
If that makes sense. Does that help? Does that seem like an all right definition? It's like
No.
I'm hoping.
It actually, I think this is a reasonably subjective issue, as well as it can be objective. And I think that you've given a very personal perspective on it. Nathan, what would you say racism is for you?
I would say racism is largely unconscious. I would say that racism looks like, I think racism is very nuanced. I don't think it's as simple as I've said earlier, I don't think it's as simple as I don't like another race. It's more to do, I think it's very nuanced. So it's, you do not have a reason, there is no rationale for the way you're behaving towards another race. You cannot answer that. You're not present enough. You're not aware enough to ask yourself and ask yourself introspectively why you are behaving that way towards another race. And I think that's where we are at this moment in time, is that there are a lot of people who don't realize that they have racial undertones, and the reason why they don't understand is because there isn't an open discussion about it. There's also a resistance. So a lot of people resist having these conversations. And what I would say with racism is generational. So through the science of epigenetics, we understand that genes and DNA gets passed down from generation to generation. So that's traits, that's certain traits that gets passed down. So why are we not having a discussion, an open discussion, that potentially from generation to generation, racism has been passed down through DNA? And that's something that I want to talk about.
Yeah.
Hey, okay.
Do you know what? There's something I picked up there, Nathan, which I thought was brilliant, because you just altered my definition. And I like this. I kind of captured it in there in this way. The racism part of it is the inability to ask ourselves, if I am being judgmental without kind of cause, reason, rationale. Do you know what I mean? So that's what I'm taking away from you on that, which is brilliant. Thank you for that.
Do you know what, Nathan? You've raised a point, and I don't know how much we can go into it, and I think we need another show for that. I really do. I think it's funny. I have an uncle, and he has a son, and they were not together most of their lives, but their mannerisms and behaviors were the same. Laugh, the look, the sense of humor, lots of things about them were the same, and they came back together later in life. It's an interesting topic. I want to ask you a question then, both of you, and it's something based on what Steve said. What do you think racists need to satisfy? What are they trying to satisfy? Something you said.
Yeah, that's a big question. Do you know what I mean? That's big. That's big. Nathan, I gotta.
Okay.
Nathan, have you got a response ready, or Or are we both kind of buying time on this one?
The thing is, I have a response. I can't remember her name. There was a psychologist, yeah, a black woman, a psychologist, and she's got a book called Isis Papers. Someone, you must know the book Isis Papers. And she really breaks down just how deep racism is. And I think really what they're trying to suppress is their fear. It's their fear for. So what she spoke about actually in that book, please, someone, if you can get me the author. That's it, Dr. Cress Wilson. Thank you, Dr. Cress Wilson. So Dr. Cress Wilson has got a wonderful book entitled.
Pause a second.
Okay.
Let's see what happens if you plug out your earphones, because there's a rattling noise. It might work better.
Hello?
Say again.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
It's a little bit better, you know. It's a little bit better.
Okay then,
Sorry
yeah,
about that.
cool.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's fine.
Francis
So yeah,
Cresswell.
that's it. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Frances Cress Wilson, she's got a book called Isis Papers. And she basically talks about how a lot of it's got to do with fear. So one perspective is that white men are scared that they're going to be extinct because there's this talk about minority and majority, but actually, in terms of melanated people on the planet, we're in the majority. So there's almost like a fear from those at the top and the upper echelon of society who are concerned we're
Put your
still the
headphones
same
on.
people.
Put them back on. Yeah, sorry. I'm just testing. Yeah.
So
Sorry,
there are
mate.
those. Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Stephen, can you mute? Maybe if you can mute it. Is yours muted?
There's a mute button on screen.
There it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what she put forward is that there is a fear that I guess, yeah, the white race, they fear that they're going to pretty much be extinct. So to stop that from happening, these are the things that they do. They put in place. So we know about Planned Parenthood in America. We know about abortions and the rate of black women who have abortions and how that gets pushed in the community. And I know this is really deep and difficult discourse, but these are things that we need to discuss. So from my perspective, I would tend to agree with Dr. Cress Wilson. There is a fear of extinction. There is fear of there being a socio-economic balance or rebalance. And I think that's what it is. It's about fear. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I think I would agree. And it's even fear. It's fear of privilege, loss of privilege, fear of loss of control, fear of loss of position. It's interesting as a white male, it's at my position, like I'm kind of I have to be quite aware of it in society. I mean, right? Because I walk down the street and I know people will see me in a different way than they might see, say, a friend of mine who's from a different culture. Just because of all the stuff that surrounds how I look as a white male and all the baggage that comes with that, all the legacy that comes with that. Do you know what I mean? But I can walk throughout a community with great privilege because, and it's really interesting, I would be least likely to be stop and search, least likely to be looked at by the shopkeeper for taking something. Do you know what I mean? All that stuff goes away and ebbs away from because of just by chance, this is how what color of skin I was born with. Which I think that's it, is the spotlight isn't on me in a lot of ways. It is, but it isn't. in a sense. Do you know what I mean? On the global, like rightfully, it is becoming more on me, right? But if you think about it, walking through, I can go and walk and navigate the world in different ways. Which, do you know what I mean? The doors open easier just because of appearance. When you contrast it against other cultures, right? In there, and that kind of stuff. And I think, and that's what I would say racists, like proper people who are really don't have that ability to ask themselves, reflect on themselves, why they hold the views they hold. That's what they're afraid of.
Do you know
They're
what
afraid
of? Sorry. I found that most interesting when, I don't know if anyone needs to go on mute, sorry, just because of the vibration. I found it most interesting when I was watching The Guardian do their short videos during Brexit, when in 2016 or 2017, they started to do a lot of short videos asking people why they wanted to leave the European Union. And that's where I started to notice 2016, 2017, a lot more, that racism then had started to evolve, which is a point that Nathan went into. And I started to think to myself, there's a lot of angry people, especially the ones up north. Like Birmingham upwards, people were angry, right? And this goes back to something you said earlier on about, sorry, there's something that people need to satisfy, because I think there's a number of things people want to satisfy. And racism is often the easy target for that. But it leads into this point that you made earlier on when it came to Brexit. People were angry with people who look like them. And then I suddenly felt like, as soon as that vote went through in 2016, I was like, this is not my country. Why do I feel like an immigrant suddenly? Not only that, but why do I feel like I'm not welcome? That's what I wanted to. So Nathan, I want to ask you, you mentioned this thing about evolution of racism, because what has happened in the last few years is that it's not just about black and white. When I was growing up, racism was just about the color of your skin. Now it's complex. And I'm going to throw something in there, because we spoke about this on the phone briefly, Nathan, and just talk to us about it. Tyree Nichols was killed by 5 officers and 1 white. Now, there's a whole story why they killed him. It wasn't anything to do with the color of his skin. I don't even know how much Derek Chauvin's situation and George Floyd was about the color of his skin. I don't know. I don't know how much that fight that took place in Surrey somewhere was about anyone's race. I don't know. But it was brought up. And so what I'm saying is that racism doesn't seem to kind of correlate, or does it? Does it, you know, what am I looking at here? Why do I feel unwelcome? Is there more to this, Nathan? Or is racism straight black and white?
So I remember, so a few weeks ago, so after the gentleman that died by the hands of those black police officers, I was listening to Piers Morgan, and he had one of the BLM members on his show, and he completely dismissed the notion they had anything to do with, you know, white supremacy or anything of those sorts. And my problem with the dismissal is a lack of critical thinking. Now, it's not about swinging the pendulum all the way to the next side and saying that it was got to do with white supremacy. I think what we need to do is look at facts and look at potential issues. So for myself, when I look at that incident, I think of police officers who are in an establishment that has been accused, and also there is evidence that they have been, there has been racial undertones in terms of treatment of black men and women, in fact. Yeah, there is camera evidence. There is evidence, well, the courts, the justice system is catching up slowly but surely, but there is evidence that puts forward that the police department, particularly in America, has racial undertones. That's not to suggest that they are completely racist, but there is to put forward, and we can all agree that there has been examples of racism. So you think of these men, forget that they're black, but they're in an environment, right? Now think about the disproportionate levels of people who get stop and search, right? Those black men are gonna be doing the same thing. They're in a system, they're influenced. Yeah, you are a product of your environment. This is what we like to say. No matter where you work, it is very difficult to go outside the box. It's very difficult to go against the grain. And I'm not saying that those black men had self-hatred in them, but what I am putting forward is that there is a potential that they could have picked up traits that they have seen in the police department, right, that has made them think the same thing, and therefore when they did see that gentleman, they felt the same way as some white police officers, and therefore they did what they had to do to that man. Secondly, another way of seeing this, and this is really for us as black people to really be open about this, right? When we are in certain workspaces, right? When we're in workspaces, we are very hostile. And this is generally speaking.
What do you mean?
Sometimes,
what do you mean?
So there is almost a feeling that sometimes you want to be the only black person in that place, in that workplace. Yeah, there's almost like when I almost feel there's more hostility towards me from my own than others. Right now, in saying that, think of the potential issues those black police officers may have had when they've gone to stop and search black men in a community. Yeah, think of what they have been potentially been called. They may have been called pigs. They may have been called snakes, because there are parts of the black community that don't like the police. So imagine black police officers doing their job and going out and just stopping people, just normally, black men, black women, and those hostilities coming towards them. Yeah, so they're picking all of this trauma and experiences up, right? So then potentially the same thing could happen. So eventually it's just one step too far, and they've been given an opportunity to, I guess, deal with their trauma. And that's another kind of potential speculative event in the minds of those men that I think needs to be put forward, is potentially actually they may have had their own traumatic experiences with black people in the community, and therefore, yeah, they had, I guess, the opportunity.
Well, you know what though? I know for a fact from slavery, light-skinned slaves were prized or regarded higher. Interestingly, if you go to the West Indies, it's still the case. Okay, my grandmother was this color, my mum was this color, my mum's dad was this color, and my dad was this. My dad is darker than this. And my grandmother would tell me stories of how, and she died at 95 about 6 years ago, and she would tell me stories about how she was treated a little bit differently in the community because of the lightness of her skin. But then when she came to the UK, she was just black. But if you go to the West Indies now, colorism is a thing. Sadly, if you go to parts of Africa, small parts of Africa, it's not a major thing, but it's there. In some of the more westernized nations, people are bleaching their skin here and there because they're trying to fit in. So they are running from something and to something. It's a bigger topic, but it's just to relate to you on that level. And if that's the case, then my grandmother was taught how to maneuver safely in the system and in society to avoid conflict. And that was passed on to her, to my mum. That was passed on to my dad. And it was also passed on to me when I was in primary school and secondary school. I guess I want to get it on, keep it on a question, but you've opened something interesting, Nathan. And Steve, the question is going on to you. And I guess what we're doing is we're just opening it up. We will never conquer it in this session, but Steve, I mean, the evolution of racism. What are you thinking?
It's interesting. And it's interesting because I also have a different perspective because I come from Canada, right? So I grew up with, like, some of my friends belong to the Six Nations, so there's like some 360 different cultural Aboriginal groups in Canada. And in one part down in southern Ontario, there's a group called the Six Nations. So it's like, I'm not going to say who they are because I don't want to get it wrong. And my memory's failing me. But some of my folks, like some of my best friends I grew up with, were part of this Six Nations. So, and it's interesting, these were the folks that experienced a lot of a different set of colonial horrors. Right. Do you know what I mean? And I watched, and it was interesting in my neighborhood. It was a pretty poor neighborhood we grew up in, but them trying to navigate between two worlds. And I would see folks, there would be fights between them because one was becoming too immersed with the white folks. Do you know what I mean? Like they were kind of, you're becoming too, it was literally like you would hear things like this, you're becoming too white, and it's really interesting. And there was one of my best friends, Kathy, we got on quite well, and she was really struggling. She was like really like the smartest tax, right? And really doing well, but she was going to go off to university, but she was getting criticized for that from people from her own community. It's really like when you think about that, like the depth of that, but there is just something about like when you kind of see it coming over time and you see it from that perspective, in that kind of area, it's really difficult to not carry that forward generationally and figure out how to navigate stuff, because you're going to have conflicting messages that come through sometimes. I think is be true to where you come from, but don't sacrifice where you need to go to. And then navigating that is really hard, I think, for a lot of people. A lot of my friends, like there were some really trying times. We had some really difficult conversations as I was navigating it with them. I was like a passenger on their journey. We were doing it together because we'd talk about it. They'd share their experience, right, in there. And I think it's really interesting that you do that. But when you go, another place in Canada was I got into social work. I worked up in the Arctic, the high Arctic in Canada. So we're way, way up there. Small little town of 1,000 people in there. And it was really interesting to see this community wasn't there before. It wasn't a natural community. It was built because they were moved from their original land. And when you think about that fear that comes down the pipe from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, it does carry in your body. I think, like Nathan's right, it does carry in your body from one generation to the next.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? In there, it's almost like, and I had a brilliant story, and you get challenged in different ways, and rightfully so. right? Like I'm thinking, like when I go back into the social work practice and I think about how I've practiced in the past, how I've had to learn, how I've had to open my mind and kind of shed off some of the blinders, right? In there. It's interesting how you kind of, when you're up in that community and you talk to a dad and say, what do you do to discipline your child? And they come back and say, why? What are they doing wrong? Do you know what I mean? It's like, oh my God, I've totally, in one fell swoop, just put forward my whole world knowledge onto them by asking, well, how do you discipline your kid?
What was wrong with that question?
Well, it's interesting in the Arctic. So, like, if you got to think about it, there's one, it's how they do the childcare rearing in the Aboriginal communities. It's much more tender than we think it may be. It's more tender than the Western European model, I might say, and it's more caring, it's more nurturing, right? So, but it's interesting. Also, in the Arctic, kids have to learn how to survive in a very harsh environment. So when they're climbing all over dad and running around the house, they're exploring in their environment. They're kind of testing their capabilities because it's minus 40 up there. You can't send them out into the play outside and test them. They have to do it in the house, right? It's interesting not having that perspective and come in and being, and this is where it's kind of, if like kind of being like a westernized kind of young person, young social worker coming into this and putting that forward, because that's what you know, that's what you get taught, right? If you think about it, a lot of our social work stuff in the Western countries comes from the.
Do you know what's interesting? This is
Yeah.
interesting. So, someone used the term whitewash. I know some of these can appear to be derogatory. I don't want it to be, but I guess we're letting off a little steam. I don't like to censor language so much, but this is how people feel. Let's talk about it. So I guess we could say that we have a very Europeanized, maybe, approach that is ingrained in us. And so when we approach other families, this is happening now. And I think this is a big thing now, where we have to be very conscious. And Nathan, if you want to chime in on this as well, we have to be very conscious of what we are bringing to the homes of these families who do things differently. Yet we have the laws and we have British standards and, you know, guidance. But what am I bringing? Let's be clear, even as a minority myself, have I got standards that are preconceived ideas that would clash with who I'm looking at, which can perceive them as being wrong? Do I have preconceived ideas that are another standard that I don't need to be applying to somebody else? Nathan, what do you want to say to this? I threw you in the deep end on this one.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I probably need more time, but I wanted to actually add something to something Stephen said. So this latest wave of kind of racism since 2016 was really fascinating. And I use the word fascinating purposefully because it's very similar to the 1920s and 30s where there was the Great Depression. And then in the 30s, there was Mussolini, Franco, and Hitler. And they were pushing forward that, you know, it was different groups of people as to the reasons why, you know, their economy was the way that it was. And it's very similar here. So you've got a lot of people in 2016 or prior to 2016 who were frustrated with the system. So in the UK, we were frustrated with the Conservatives. In America, they were frustrated with the Democrats. And what ends up happening very similarly is you have somebody who comes out of nowhere and is just pushing a very nuanced, but very explicit message. And in the 1930s, you had three of them, but really you had one person in this generation, Mr. Donald Trump. And then what ended up happening was that people exposed themselves.
Yeah.
So people exposed themselves. So then all of a sudden, when they were living next to, I don't know, Miss Abner next door, and they were getting along with Miss Abner next door, all of a sudden, Miss Abner's the problem now.
Yeah.
Geeta, Miss Geeta is the problem now. And this is the problem with, and this is why racism needs to be discussed, because what ends up happening is that sometimes it exposes itself when things are going wrong in society. When things go wrong in society, for some reason, it goes back. It goes back to a group of people. It's their fault.
Okay. So if that's the case, are we suggesting that racism isn't about black and white then?
Oh yes, it's all over the place. Yeah, absolutely.
Let
Most
me ask you a
definitely.
question.
It's gone.
My question is, from what you've just said, it sounds like then that racism is not just about skin color. That's my question.
Yes, more than that. And this is why we need to have these discussions, because in my mind, for a long time, I have really tried to work out the difference between racial bias and racism. Now, racial bias, for me, is not an issue, and I'll tell you why. So if I look at my current establishment, the place that I work in, right? I would say the three biggest attributes to social groups are as follows: gender, religion, and race, right? Now, looking at those social groups, I don't necessarily think there's a problem there, because there's commonality there. There's things that you can talk about, and that's something that is natural. It's natural to want to be around someone who where there are common themes amongst yourself. So this is why we need to have these discussions, because from that perspective, where I'm seeing groups where it's just mainly, I don't know, Bengalis or Pakistanis or whites, it may not necessarily be from a perspective of they think other races are inferior to them. It may just be commonality. And this is why we need to have these deep-rooted discussions, because I do think sometimes we use racial bias. We're trying to remove something very natural to us. Because if we look at the majority of us, I remember Jordan Peterson saying this, if you look at the majority of people, the majority of if you look at every race, the majority of the closest people to them are people within their own race. And that's not the issue. The issue is your behavior and attitudes, and that's where we have to really start towing the line. But I think it's very, 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 there's a very, very thin line between racial bias and racism.
You know, I had that opinion of Donald Trump as well. People get upset with me. I'm going to say this. I think he reminds me of Jeremy Clarkson. Even, what's his name? What's his name?
Robinson.
Thank you. I wonder how racist they are. I wonder how much they hate black people, if at all. They've been, in my opinion, I use the word irreverent in what they've said. I don't know them well enough. Now, I know that they've said things that might make us think they don't like people of a certain skin color or heritage. But further discussions with them, you would see that they don't not like people of other heritage, but they might have a group mentality attitude. Do you get what I'm saying? So I don't know how we're using the term racial bias. Racial bias is like Donald Trump may well actually think Mexicans are X, but I don't think he wouldn't mind sitting down and eating with one and having a conversation with them. I don't think he has that problem. But he has been very irreverent in what he said, and I think that he may have a lot of biases that he's unaware of. Do you get what I'm saying?
All right, let me put a question out. You know, when Donald Trump When COVID first came out and Donald Trump called it the Chinese flu, was that racist?
I don't know. Steve,
do,
what are you saying?
well,
You're on mute.
it's
You're on
got,
mute, Steve.
it's interesting. As soon as you mentioned Trump, I just kind of think, do you know what I mean? Was it racist? Was it biased? Or was it just plain dumb? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's because, yeah, he's a character, right? He's a
Yeah,
character.
yes, yes,
Do you
yes.
know what I mean? It's it's interesting. I was thinking there because Nathan, you mentioned like three main categorizations in terms of like kind of like the groups, right? The gender, religion, race. I think right in there. I was kind of thinking a fourth, and it's wealth, because if you think about this, when you get into the idea of having wealth, right? Wealth is actually the ability to have more resources than another person, really,
Yeah.
right? So, because as you kind of, and you think about the work, because I think, Nathan, you were talking about the workplace environment, so it's kind of nice to keep that alive. If you think about that, people get raises, right? People go up the wealth ladder in work. Well, what happens when you get up there? Different connections, different ways of being, different ways of seeing things. So I would wonder if there's, and that's another, wealth is another way of having power because you have more choice, right? You have more resources to exercise and use.
So what you're saying is that racism is a spectrum. No, no, it's a spidergram.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and it's interesting. I have this like kind of thought forming in my mind, right, which is brilliant. Is because race will right like when you think of racism, because and I saw a comment come up about attitudes and beliefs, and I'm a firm believer in that idea, right? But when you think of, is it that racism is a functional problem that those who hold wealth and power perpetuate in a lot of ways? It's a functional problem in terms that it serves a purpose to perpetuate it because it pits people against each other easily.
But you know something. This is
Yeah,
my. I think this is making my point even further. Like
yeah,
I think that racism is about the in group and out group,
yeah. That's what
and
I'm
that
getting
could be
at.
based on wealth. It could be based on. If we look at the genocide that happened in Rwanda in the 90s,
Yeah.
two families, two tribes living together,
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
and Jesuits went in there and started to divide them by their appearance, and they started to hack each other to death with machetes.
Yeah.
And then the world looks at them as subhuman, subconsciously, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But that happened also in Europe
Yeah.
around the same time, but
Mm-hmm.
with guns, which is a little bit more acceptable. Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that um, racism is about, well, we are the same color, maybe different, slightly different language, because then I'm moving on to the point of now, how do two minorities, which is what we saw in the media, start attacking each other like that?
Mm-hmm.
If
Mm-hmm.
it's true, for example, but it happens based on race. What is the psychology behind that, in your opinion? What are your thoughts on that?
That's huge. Like it's interesting because you think it's interesting. I saw that clip that you're talking about, and there was a one with girls as well, I think, or something. Another one that I saw, it might have been out of the States, but it's kind of it's really hard, but and it's going to sound really awful, I think, but it is an honest, open conversation to kind of just get juices and thought flowing. But if you're one of them, like one of those folks in that situation, and you've got all that systemic stuff, all that interpersonal turmoil, why wouldn't you? And it sounds really harsh to say that. Why wouldn't you like? Why wouldn't you just want to kind of lash out and have something over another person just for a moment?
Interesting.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's almost like raw thought process without reflection, and just kind of go, do you know what? I'm going to have you. Enough of this. Do you know what I mean? What do you think, Nathan? Or have we gone kind of a bit sideways?
So we a lot of us, we don't want to have uncomfortable discussions, and black and brown people have a there is a race, there are racial undertones with black and brown people. So more specifically, I'm talking about East Asian, talking about Bengalis, Pakistanis, Indians, with Africans. There is, and Caribbeans, and it's both sides. Yeah, I have friends right now. I will be explicit and honest, who use the P word when they're upset with someone from East Asia. They will use the P word. Yeah, I have been on. I have experienced racism with brown. With brown people. Brown people have called me the N word. Do you understand? And I think what the problem with us, right, both black and brown people, is that the energy is aimed towards the white race. Yeah, the legacy of the white race and what's happening now, and everything's towards white people, white people, white people. And I'm not dismissing that. But what I have an issue with is that black and brown people are not having discussions about racism with each other. And this is why I've never accepted BAME. This is why I've never accepted POC, because we have our own very individual identities and experiences. And what it does, what BAME does for me is it categorizes us together as if we are one. We are not one. Because at very grassroots level, there are big instances of racism. When I was growing up in Forest Gate in East London...
Hold on. Forest Gate, right? Nathan, I'm sorry, he was on a roll. Forest Gate, I got 40 seconds. I got to change this live. Because Instagram cuts it, right? We'll come back in on Forest Gate. All right, people, listen. Join me in about 20 seconds. Trust me. I want to hear it. Because Nathan was on a roll and I feel bad. Let's go. I'll see you guys in a moment.
All right.